Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I am a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Today's webinar, titled Behind the Meter Projects, is the 7th webinar of the 2020 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted on the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar, if not already posted. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with some opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and deployment supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs and is duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. She oversees the deployment program, which is national in scope. Specifically, the deployment program includes financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and outreach. She also implements national funding opportunities and administers some of the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 20+ years. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to today's webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy. The Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy infrastructure installation, reducing energy costs, and the electrification of Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, the deployment program works within the Department of Energy, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. This Tribal Energy webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. The webinar series is also part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy business and economic development decision-making and information sharing amongst tribes. It is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, as you'll hear today, and identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. In today's webinar, we will focus on behind-the-meter energy projects. These projects have unique benefits and challenges and are typically easier to develop than larger projects that connect to the distribution or transmission grid. Today's presenters will discuss the things you need to know before embarking on one of these projects, including policies and regulations that allow for behind-the-meter projects. We also have a case study that will showcase some of the benefits and challenges of behind-the-meter projects. We do hope that this webinar and the webinar series as a whole is useful to you, so we welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there's any way we can make this series better. Before I turn it back to James, I did want to personally thank each of the presenters for giving up their time in preparing for and in presenting on today's webinar. Thank you all. And with that, the virtual floor is yours, James.
Thank you, Lizana. Before we get to the presentations, I will introduce all of today's presenters. For our first presentation, we will hear from Carlin Corey. Carlin is a mechanical engineer who manages a 19-person project development and finance group at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, also known as NREL. The group informs the direction of future technology and policy research at NREL by helping clients, such as tribes, the Department of Defense, and other federal agencies, meet ambitious energy goals in today's marketplace. Ms. Corey is a subject matter expert in renewable energy financial analysis, renewable energy policy, and electricity market analysis. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Tufts University and a Master of Science in Technology and Policy from MIT. Following Carlin, we will hear from Margie Shaw. Margie is a partner at Kaneem and Associates, or Kaneem Associates, LLC, where she assists tribes and tribal organizations with their energy-related issues, including tribal utility formation, electric power generation projects, high voltage transmission issues, rights of way, and energy strategies. Margie has been an attorney for over 30 years and manages her own law practice, Margie Shaw and Associates. Margie's practice provides legal advice to tribes in the areas of tribal legal codes, tribal utility negotiations, electric power and transmission contracting, oil and gas, tribal energy resource development, and business matters. Margie has also published law review articles, including regulation of electric utilities on Indian reservations and Indian Allotee water rights, a case study of allotments on the former Mulhire Indian reservation. Our final presentation is a case study of a solar project being implemented by the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe. Lacey Neuenfeld and Robert Burns will jointly present this case study. Lacey grew up on a cattle ranch outside of Flandreau, South Dakota, which is on the eastern side of the state. She acquired a Bachelor of Science in Economics from South Dakota State University, then a Juris Doctorate at the University of South Dakota School of Law. Lacey is both a tribal prosecutor as well as Senior Assistant Attorney General, serving as one of 4 in-house attorneys. In 2017, she applied and became certified as a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney for purposes of prosecution on Flandreau Santee Sioux Tribe Reservation. In her role as in-house counsel, Lacey appreciates the diverse array of projects she is assigned, including the solar project she is speaking about today. Lacey is a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe and a member of the South Dakota and Florida bars. Robert Burns is an organic chemist from the educated at the University of Massachusetts and owner of Nebraska Renewable Energy Systems, NRES for short. Robert has been developing solar and wind for almost 15 years and has been working closely with Native Americans for over 10 years in both Nebraska and South Dakota. NRES operates a totally off-grid sustainable farm in Lyons, Nebraska that features solar, wind, biomass, and biogas systems. In addition to producing livestock and fruit, Barnes also manages projects involving solar, vegetable oil systems, including hemp. Robert's work resulted in the first and largest commercial biodiesel plant in eastern Nebraska and the first off-grid renewable fuels facility of its type in the Midwest. Having made the state's first biodiesel in 2006, NRES is currently involved with installing the most advanced solar systems in the state of Nebraska. Recent achievements include producing the first grapeseed oil in Nebraska and deployment of over 1 megawatt of net metered solar on tribal lands. Thanks to each of our presenters for making time to join us today. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Carlin, you may proceed once your slides are up.
Great, thank you so much, James. And it's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you about behind the meter projects. I'm going to be providing an overview, and if you have questions, as was mentioned earlier, save them to the end, but I'm certainly available to answer questions now, or if something comes to you in the future, please feel free to reach out to me then. Next slide, please. So these are the topics that I'm going to be covering today. So I'll talk about behind the meter power projects. You'll see it mentioned as BTM, what they are, why they're desirable. I'll also talk about the importance of incentives, net energy metering, and other policies, how they work and how they support these behind the meter power projects. How to think about scoping projects, both in terms of the size of the systems as well as project economics, And then finally, I'll talk about solar photovoltaic or PV business structures. There's the solar PPA, the solar lease, and direct ownership. Next slide, please. So what is behind the meter power generation? So I wanted to put it in context, and power generation can really be located in 3 different places. Distributed generation, or DG, is located on the distribution system. It can be behind the meter, which is on the customer side of the meter, or it can be interconnected to the utility distribution on the utility side of the meter. So we're really talking about behind the meter generation. It's smaller, it's usually less than the total load of the particular customer, whether it's a residential customer, a commercial customer, something like a community center or a library or something like that. Large utility scale generation is interconnected to the utility transmission system. So those are the typical really large power plants. So the advantage of distributed generation, and particularly behind the meter, is that you're generating the power closer to the load, closer to where the power is being used. You therefore avoid transmission and distribution losses. And if it's designed right, you can also increase resiliency against large weather events, outages, etc. Next slide. So what are some of the reasons people pursue behind the meter projects? There's certainly energy cost savings. You get control over project operations and maintenance. There's self-consumption of distributed generation, and the most widely used right now is solar PV or solar photovoltaics. It's also a visible commitment to sustainability when you use solar PV, and when combined with battery storage can help with resiliency against any outages. Next slide. So there are definitely some best practices when you are trying to screen for behind the meter project. So it's really important to identify the relevant load or loads. Generally behind the meter is on one building. There are cases where it can serve multiple buildings. You also want to identify the project site. Maybe it will be on the rooftop, or maybe it will be on the ground, which is called ground-mounted solar. You want to understand the solar resource or the solar insolation at your particular location, and that's the characterization of the solar resource. Evaluate the different technology options. There are different kinds of panels, different kinds of inverters that can be used, and so working with experts to help you identify the best option for your situation, and at least comparing them is always a good idea. Estimating the economics helps you understand some of the differences between the technology choices. If you have access to both of a rooftop as well as some land, you might want to compare rooftop versus ground mount. And so then the economics can change in all of those different configurations. Identifying financing alternatives is really important. You might have some cash on hand. You might need to get a loan. You might be able to take advantage of incentives. Bringing all of that together into a financial engineering package is really important to understand what options you can move forward with. And one of the most important things is engage your utility early. No matter what kind of relationship you have with your utility, they will need to work with you in order to interconnect and approve your behind the meter system. And therefore, engaging with them as early as possible will help them be on your side, talk through some of the constraints that you may not be aware of, and you might be able to find a way to a solution that works for everyone. I will note that NREL provides technical assistance thanks to the Department of Energy Indian Energy Program, and I've provided the link in case you would like to learn more. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the incentives, net energy metering, or NEM, and other policies, because these state and utility policies can provide some great support. So who provides the incentive is important to understand. Different utilities will provide different incentives. Some of them are specifically focused on distributed generation or on behind the meter distributed generation specifically. States will provide incentives as well. Federal incentives are really only tax credits, and would, in order to take advantage of them, would require working with a third-party provider. There are different types of financial incentives that could be provided. Sometimes there's an upfront amount. It might be a dollar amount or a percentage of the total cost, or sometimes qualified costs of a system. Some of them are performance-based, where it's on a cents per kilowatt hour basis. And then there are cash or tax. They could either be positioned as cash, where it's more like a rebate, or a tax credit where you need to be paying taxes in order to take advantage. I put a link at the bottom for the database for renewable energy and efficiency. It's desireusa.org. That's a great place to start looking up incentives. However, it is updated probably every 6 months, and so it may not have all of the latest and greatest, but it's certainly a great place to start. But then going to your utilities website and your state energy office website is also helpful as well. Next slide, please. So I've provided this map. This is from Desire, the Desire website, and it's a nice picture. Net energy metering has really taken hold in the United States, and most states do have mandatory net energy metering rules. Let's see, 35 states have mandatory rules. There are 5 states that are in transition, thinking about what policy they want in place after net metering, and I have a couple alternatives I will mention. And even where there are no statewide mandatory rules, like in Texas and Idaho, some utilities do allow net metering. So this is a really prominent policy. And the next slide, we'll talk a little more of the details. So this schematic might look complicated at first, and let me walk you through it. Essentially, with net energy metering, this looks at a PV system that is on a house. So the PV system is on the house, and it provides power directly to the house. So you can see the appliances there. Depending on the time of day, the month of the year, there might be excess generation that happens. That excess generation is in the yellow arrow with the lines, and that is then sold to the utility. And then there are times when the PV system doesn't provide enough, and the blue energy comes in from the utility and is used in the house to provide the power. So what you can see is with the bidirectional meter, what it means is it spins forward when you're using electricity from the utility, and it will spin backwards when you are providing electricity to the utility. So by having this ability, it essentially nets the amount of power that you use. And you can see in the gray box that you know, there's the usage, which shows your load that you get from the electricity, which is blue.
There's that which was self-consumed, which is the green, and then there's the orange, which is what was exported to the utility. And because of the bidirectional meter, that which was used and self-consumed is not monitored, and that which is exported is. So you then use, under the metering, you use the blue boxes and you export the orange. And therefore that the sum of those two, or well, the difference between those two, but sum in this, since it's positive and negative, gets to what your total bill is. So there's more details in the document that this came from. And the great thing about, I mean, the main thing is that net energy metering just allows you to get credit where you don't have to buy all of your power from the utility. You actually get to save the amount of electricity based on the retail rate. So next slide. Now, I talked about excess generation, and excess generation is where you export to the grid. Excess generation, it can roll over. It usually rolls over within one entire year, sometimes within each month or billing period. So if it is summer and your PV system generates a lot of extra power, more than you can use, you're actually able to take that credit and roll it over into the next month up to a year. At the end of the year, or sometimes a month, the excess generation is either lost, credited or paid at the avoided cost, or credited or paid at the retail rate. Of the three of those, the retail rate is the highest. So if you are credited and paid at the retail rate, then that's great. Behind the meter PV systems generally are designed in order to meet the average annual load at that particular site. And so the treatment of excess generation is really an important design element and something to be cognizant of when you're designing your system. Next slide, please. So another alternative to net energy metering is BuyAll SellAll. And in this one, you actually have two separate meters. So your PV system on top of the house has a production meter that is provided directly to the utility, and the utility pays for all of the kilowatt hours that are produced. Separately, the load, the ratepayer or customer has a consumption meter. And you can see the blue coming in from the grid. That's the grid electricity, and it provides the electricity to the house. And so it's different from net metering, where you then consume and you pay the retail rate of the load, which is the blue, and you are paid for the full output of your distributed generation system. And that is paid for at a sell rate, which is generally not equal to the retail rate, although it could be. And again, I include the source from NREL at the bottom. So some utilities have this. They find it helpful to understand not just the net of what is being used, but they understand both what their customers are producing in terms of power and what they are using to heat their home, provide for their fridge, etc. Next slide, please. So the other configuration that is used, or policy, that's an alternative to net energy metering, is net billing. So with net billing, you again have two separate meters. The DG system provides power to the house, and then any net GG exports or excess on a minute-by-minute basis goes through a separate net electricity export meter, and this happens on an instantaneous basis. Again, during those times of day or seasons of the year when you're still using electricity, but the PV system is not generating, you can still use grid electricity to provide your needs, and that is known through the, that is monitored through the consumption meter. And so it's similar to net energy metering, but again, it gives some additional information to the utilities about what the consumption is and what is being exported on a minute by minute basis. Next slide, please. So how do you scope solar photovoltaic behind the meter projects? Let's take a look. Next slide. So in terms of project considerations, it's really important to understand and work within the net energy metering law. So you need to understand the available roof space or ground space and the characteristics. So for ground mounted systems, the slope or the angle that the ground runs is important. Sometimes the geotechnic features of the ground might prevent a system from being installed or might require a more expensive ballast system, which would increase the price. However, the amount of space that you have helps determine how big your PV system could be. You also need to understand some of the site conditions. If it will be mounted on a roof, is the roof pointing north-south or east-west or all of the above? The azimuth is important, as well as understanding the shading and whether there are trees or other buildings that will prevent the sun from reaching your roof. These site conditions will determine how much power your system can generate both monthly as well as annually. Then you need to think about sizing the project at or below the total on-site average load. So if the system will supply one building, then you need to understand how much power or electricity that building uses on a monthly or annual basis. And you typically size the system at or below 100% of the average load. And again, the net energy metering laws are really important here. There are some states where they don't allow it to meet 100% average load, although that is most common. I'm in Colorado, and in Colorado, they allow it to meet 120%. However, it's going to hover around 100%. So it's very important to understand what happens to excess generation, because your rooftop could be larger than and provide more power output than your actual load. So if the excess generation is lost, that is not desirable. So you'd want to aim for a project size that is smaller than the 100% load's average load. If you're paid or credited at the avoided cost rate or at the retail rate, then having a system that is sized to 100% of the load can make more sense. The comparison of all of these is going to be important. And then if you change from rooftop to ground mount, you kind of need to reevaluate these things as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of system economics, it has certainly been true for many years now that the cost of solar PV has been decreasing over time. I didn't note it in the graphs, but these are costs of residential PV or solar PV systems over time. You can see that on average, the top graph shows that on average, the costs have been going down significantly, and they're now lower than $3 per watt. The other thing is it can change significantly by state. You can see that on the left-hand side, the median gross costs are the bars at the bottom. And in Arizona, the gross cost is significantly lower than it is in Colorado. $2.70 per watt versus $3.15 per watt. The US average is shown in red in the middle. The system size also changes too, depending on the state. And you can see California has the lowest system size. And part of that is because California has made a real effort to do energy efficiency. And by doing that effort, then each of the individual homes has a lower load and therefore can only support a smaller PV system. So the costs have decreased over time. They're still projected to continue to decrease, and it varies by state. Residential systems compared to a larger system, like for a community center, are generally more expensive. They're not able to take advantage of economies of scale. However, if there are multiple, there's a neighborhood or multiple houses that are interested at the same time, by coming together and doing a bulk purchase, that can help bring down the cost for everyone. And as I mentioned, the community systems are a bit cheaper. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll talk about the solar PV business structures in a little bit more detail so you can understand them. So first is direct ownership. This is pretty typical and pretty desirable. I mean, certainly if you go out and buy equipment for your house, then you have immediate ownership and control. You can get it installed and it's a clear, visible commitment to sustainability. You yourself are able to use any state or utility incentives for which you're eligible. You do have all operations and maintenance responsibilities, so that would be very similar to a refrigerator or a hot water heater. It does require upfront cash and/or financing if you're not able, if you don't have enough cash ready to pay for the system. It does have higher financing rates than third parties. However, you also don't have to pay the third parties to help you with the system. I say no tax incentives. There are some, the tax incentives are, again, generally go to those who pay taxes. And if anybody, so generally tax incentives are not available. And then, of course, you do have to own the roof or the land. If you are leasing or renting, direct ownership becomes a much greater challenge. Next slide. So this is the solar PPA. I should have spelled that out. PPA stands for Power Purchase Agreement. And a solar PPA is a contract. And it is it constitutes a relationship between really the consumer and the system owner. The consumer will continue, as I showed earlier, to buy traditional electricity from their utility. And once the consumer has the PV on their house, they are able to sell the power to the utility, and the utility buys the unused solar electricity. It does require a net metering and interconnection agreement between the consumer or the customer and the utility. The system owner has a relationship with the utility too. The utility will buy generally the renewable energy credits from the system owner, and the RECs are therefore provided to the utility. One of the key things of the solar PPA is that the customer or consumer buys electricity from the system owner as it's generated. So this is on a cents per kilowatt hour basis. That provides a nice motivation for the system owner to keep the system working in top shape and on a daily basis, because if it is not working in top shape and on a daily basis, they do not receive payments. So this is the solar PPA system and how the money flows, as well as the electricity and the renewable energy certificates. Next slide shows a solar lease arrangement. The solar lease arrangement is very similar, and you'll see most of the language is the same. The thing that has changed is the agreement between the system owner and the customer or the consumer. The customer will pay a fixed scheduled payment to lease the PV system. This is generally $1 per month payment. Think of it like when you go to a car dealership and you lease a car. You pay them a regular monthly amount, a monthly payment, no matter how much you drive. Here, you pay a fixed scheduled payment in dollars per month, no matter how much the system generates. So that is kind of the key difference. The reason why these two configurations exist and contracting structures exist is because there are some states where a solar PPA is not allowed and a solar lease is. So knowing what is relevant to you is going to be important, and you can get that information on the Desire website. They have a really nice map that explains some of the state laws. Next slide. So how do you choose which of these financing and contracting options is the right one for you? This table provides an overview of and a comparison between the financing options. And so with self-financing, you are able to take advantage of state cash incentives if you're eligible. However, you cannot use the federal investment tax credit, which is 22% tax credit provided to an entity who pays taxes and has a large enough tax appetite. And you also cannot take advantage of accelerated depreciation. And sometimes there are state tax credits, which are separate from state cash incentives. And if you don't have a tax appetite, you can't take advantage of that either. You do have the responsibility for the upfront costs as well as for the operations and maintenance costs, both the costs as well as actually getting it fixed. With the third-party ownership PPA or power purchase agreement, it is eligible to take advantage of state cash incentives. Generally, it's a party like Bank of America or somebody with a large tax appetite who is able to use the federal ITC and accelerated depreciation and state tax credits, although the state tax credits requires that the entity have enough tax liability within that particular state. You as the host of the system do not have to come up with the upfront costs and do not have to come up with the O&M. That is left for the third-party owner of the system. And then in terms of the solar lease, they're also able to take advantage of the state cash incentives as well as the tax credits. And as the system owner, you don't have the responsibility of the upfront costs. And then O&M is something that needs to be discussed. With a solar lease, a common practice, however you need to read the fine print, is you could have the developer provide O&M services to you. You'll have to pay for those services, but then they will monitor the system and make sure that it's performing as expected. So I hope that's a helpful for understanding why you might choose one financing option over another. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to again mention that the Department of Energy provides technical assistance that's available. There's 3 main categories where this TA or technical assistance is provided. We can provide it in terms of strategic energy planning, in terms of technical analysis, like some of those technical choices I mentioned earlier, and the financial analysis in terms of helping determine which financing structure will best meet your needs and goals. I provided the technical assistance link right here, and you can also apply for technical assistance directly through the second link. Next slide. Finally, there are some free NREL TechnoEconomic Tools. Reopt Lite is a model that examines economic viability, critical load outages, integration, and optimization. It includes solar PV, wind, and battery energy storage systems, and right now they're adding combined heat and power, or CHP. The user is able to enter your own input data and therefore check out what the economic viability and potential is at your site. Similarly, the System Advisor model software facilitates project level decision making. It has a number of additional technologies like geothermal, biomass, marine, etc. You are also able to enter your own input data, and I've provided the two websites so that you can check them out. And that's it from me. Last slide just shows my contact information, a picture of who I am and what I look like. So please do feel free to, if you have questions today that don't get answered, feel free to get in contact with me later down the road. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlin. Excellent presentation. A lot of good material there, and some of those slides on the business structures I think are going to be great reference slides for people to look at down the road if they're once they figure out what regime they're operating under. With that foundation laid, we're going to move on to a presentation from Margie Schaaf, who will talk about how tribal law can impact some of these behind the meter projects. Margie, go ahead once your slides are up.
Well, hello everyone, and happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and thank you to DOE for providing this great service to tribes. So as we all know, when a tribe wants to install a behind-the-meter small solar or wind project to serve a tribal building or a residence, you need to work with your local utility to connect the project. The utility will have policies and procedures about this, and they will also have policies and procedures about how the project will be accounted for on your electric bill. Sometimes the policies will limit the size or type of your project. These policies were generally approved. They were generally created by the utility, but then approved by the State Utility Commission. As we just heard also, sometimes the state utility commissions or the utilities offer incentives, and you are entitled to these incentives if you've been paying your utility bills, because oftentimes your bill will contain a little adder that will make sure that these incentives can be offered to everyone. So I'm here to talk about the Indian law principles of the regulation of behind-the-meter renewable energy projects in Indian country. And the hope here is that what I have to say will provide you some flexibility in working with your utility and in working with the rules that your utility has set up. Next slide, please. So first, some background. This here is a depiction of a traditional utility system. It shows the generation plant, high voltage transmission lines, and then there's a red line kind of in the middle of the graphic there that shows the distinction between what's federally regulated, which is the high voltage stuff on the left-hand side, and then the lower voltage stuff on the right-hand side, which is either state or tribally regulated. So there's a picture at the bottom of the red line that shows a solar panel. And this means basically that your renewable energy projects can either be federally regulated if they're attached to the federally regulated system, the high voltage stuff, so if it's a large scale project, or it is state or tribally regulated if it's on the smaller voltage side of things. So the topics we're talking about today are generally rooftop or projects that are next to or near a load. So those are generally state and tribally regulated. Next slide, please. So under principles of federal Indian law, we apply balancing tests. And so for Indian loads on trust lands on reservations, the behind-the-meter projects and other projects or utility activities not in interstate commerce can be regulated by the tribe. When there are publicly available tribal laws and regulations in place which contradict state net metering rules or utility tariffs or other kind of rules that are mandated or approved by the state, tribal law would govern. So for non-Indian lands or fee lands within reservations, you again have to apply balancing tests using different criteria because on non-Indian lands or fee lands within the reservation, there is a little bit of a different analysis. Next slide, please. So here's the fine print. You know, I'm a lawyer. I have to give you the fine print. So the applicable Indian law that relates to non-Indian utilities, there is primary jurisdiction over land that is Indian country rests with the federal government and with the tribe inhabiting the land and not with the states. Tribes have the inherent sovereign authority in Indian country to regulate entities doing business on tribal lands as an essential attribute of Indian sovereignty, and it's a necessary instrument of self-government and territorial management. However, absent a treaty or federal law, a tribe has no civil regulatory authority over non-members, which I mean utilities, with two major exceptions. The tribe may regulate the activities of the non-members who enter consensual relationships with the tribe or its members through commercial dealing, contracts, leases, or other arrangements. A tribe may also retain inherent power to exercise civil authority over conduct of non-members, the utilities, when that conduct threatens or has some direct effect on political integrity, economic security, or health and welfare of the tribe. So there are a number of cases that apply this balancing test. And a lot of cases have been made that utility matters do have direct effect on political integrity, economic security, and health and welfare of the tribe. There are a number of tax cases that can relate to this because they show how tribes can regulate others doing business on the reservation. And those tax cases do make very clear that utilities should not be charging any state taxes to the tribe or the tribal members on reservations. We also have one federal case that directly addresses the issue of utility, the tribe's ability to regulate a utility in Indian country. And this is the Devil's Lake Sioux Indian tribe, now called Spirit Lake Sioux, versus the North Dakota Public Service Commission. This was a 1995 case that kind of bounced around the lower circuits and then up into the appellate courts. But the bottom line is that the tribe, well, what the case said is the tribe did not have exclusive authority to regulate the provision of electricity services on the reservation. However, where the service sought is to the tribal business located on tribal trust land, they found that the necessary nexus between the tribal interests and inherent sovereignty is present. Therefore, the tribe does have the authority, even in North Dakota, where generally there is kind of a less liberal interpretation of Indian law. Even in those areas, there is the right of tribes to regulate the utilities as they provide service to tribal loads on the reservation. So for any tribal attorneys who want additional resources, there are law review articles available that can go into these details, and I'm happy to share those with you. Next slide, please. So one of the best ways, and it's even stated in that North Dakota case and in other cases that are similar, one of the best ways for the tribes to assure that they are making clear the tribal intentions and describing the political integrity and reasons for the tribe to have these energy programs is to have tribal energy laws. So if you have a solar or wind project coming up, you might want to develop a few laws which can help in your ability to talk with your utility. First of all, consider the jurisdictional statements in the tribe's constitution, applicable treaties, and other governance documents. Oftentimes it will say that the tribe has some particular jurisdiction on the reservation or when dealing with certain issues on affecting the tribe's political integrity. A tribe can carefully develop additional laws related to its utility service to clarify and to forestall any issues of jurisdiction or to provide for dispute resolution in tribal courts. Even without the tribal energy laws, utilities are flexible in applying their tariffs in Indian country, because technically you can go to the utility when they come to you and say, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that project, and say, well, if that's based on your state tariff or a state approved tariff, and it is contrary to tribal law, they can be flexible with their application. So it may take some education of your utility to help them understand these principles. The bottom line is that these offer opportunities for negotiations with your utility. Next slide, please. I have a list here of some example tribal energy laws, some of which have been enacted by tribes across the country. One option is a sustainability code, which talks about the percentage of renewable energy power that the tribe may want to have as a goal. Many states have these kinds of renewable energy standards or portfolios. A tribe can certainly do that and make it part of the sustainability code. Those kind of codes can also address things like electric vehicles and other kinds of options that the tribe may be considering. Other tribal energy laws include your water code, because water, of course, is an energy resource, an eminent domain code, a net metering code, utility franchise codes, utility service provisions codes, which regulates things like shutting off utilities, the ability of the tribal council or another tribal body to review rates and tariffs that are in place by the utility, a right-of-way code, a tribal utility code if you have your own utility, building efficiency codes, environmental and planning codes that are applicable to utilities, a code that prohibits state taxes and provides a form for tribal members to give to their utility to let the utility know that they should not be taxed with state taxes. And then also there are opportunities for taxation of utility property. Next slide, please. So since we're here to talk about net metering, I wanted to go into the net metering code example provisions a little bit more in detail. Here's some of the things that you could consider. You can, again, establish those utility goals or benchmarks for the amount of renewable energy that the tribe wants to see on the reservation. The utility does have to comply with these things. You can have a requirement to offer net metering and to specify the types of relationship that net metering has to comply with. The applicable types of generation, whether it's just for solar and wind or any other kind of generation. You can address the size of the facility that's allowed, how the net metering is accounted and billed, the type of metering. As we heard in the last presentation, you can do the meters in a lot of different ways, and the tribe can decide how best to meter their own projects. You can also provide in your code the rates applicable to the power generated, keeping in mind, of course, that you have to allow the utility to recover its costs. You can also have interconnection processes and customer costs identified, how renewable energy credits are dealt with, how disputes are handled, and then any civil penalties for non-compliance. Next slide, please. I think that's all I had, so I will allow time for questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Margie. Excellent presentation. Some interesting ideas there for tribes to consider. And yeah, it'd be great to get some questions from the audience for you. With that, let's go to our last presentation. We have a case study about some behind the meter projects in South Dakota on the Flandreau Reservation. Please proceed, Lacey and Robert, once your slides are up.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Lacey Neuenfeld, and I'm pretty excited to talk about the case, talk about the Flandreau Santee Sioux Tribe's 2019 solar project as a case study today. The tribe has been working with Robert Burns as its consultant, and Robert is with Nebraska Renewable Energy Systems, and he'll be presenting with me. Next slide, please. So for anyone that doesn't know where Flandreau is, it is on the very right side of the map with the yellow circle. We're very close to the Minnesota border. The state of Minnesota, that area was historically the homelands of the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribal membership. And so they have settled around Flandreau, South Dakota, and have reservation lands spread around the county here. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's pretty exciting about the tribe is that it's really been focusing recently about its commitment to building its energy infrastructure. A couple of years ago, it created a utility commission, and on the commission, there are a couple of members of the executive committee, one of the individuals in the tribe's natural resources department, and maintenance as well. And so they kind of lay the groundwork for the long-term vision of the tribe and its energy needs and where it wants to go. So the 2019 solar project, it really does meet the goals that the Energy Commission is setting forth. And if we go to the next slide, I'll let Robert kind of talk a little bit more about the project and the technical aspects.
Robert, you might be on mute.
No, I'm here. I got bumped off there for a second. So on our solar project, we had looked across the breadth of the tribal community, and we found 11 sites that were productive and for behind meter development. We looked at the quantity of the bill, the platforms where the solar panels could be mounted, all that were things that were previously discussed. One of the aspects that we wanted to develop within the one of the goals of the grant, which we always appreciate, was the development of internal capacity. So our project was developed with a keen eye toward utilizing indigenous personnel and existing organizations within the tribe to do the installation process, have that buy-in, that knowledge of the system, how it goes together to facilitate future maintenance and stuff. And of course, the local deployment of solar gave us a very competitive cost point to carry forward because there were no outside contractors. All the materials were bought wholesale. So economically, it was a very attractive deal. Next slide. This is a map of the kind of the core area called the square in Flandreau, and we kind of did a numbering of the different sites here where this this Topic 2 grant kind of covered for us. A real diversity of applications. It was an excellent exposure for the maintenance crews to see the various, and we'll mention some of them, the various forms of support structure, ground mount, roof mount, pole mount. And it was a pretty thorough in one swoop. We really got a pretty thorough integration of solar into the tribal core area. Next slide. We did have some technical factors I would consider. When I say high electrical rates in South Dakota, I'm talking like 10, 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So that may not impress many of us here with some of those costs, but for us they were significant. We always overlay our usage summaries with the anticipated consumption or production of the solar, so we can ensure that the system is properly sized. And policy, as was already mentioned very well, policy becomes a key factor. It's kind of like the music that you have to dance to, and we want to both maximize our capability under that existing policy, for the best economic impact. In this particular region, we were capped at 40 to 50 kW as system sizes in the distribution policies that existed, but it's not true net metering. And if you remember back on that Desire national map that was shown, South Dakota really has nothing. It is not technically a net metering in the sense that there is a monthly true up. It's an instantaneous true up at the meter. So if one minute you're making excess and the next minute you're not, that short, brief excess that's delivered across the meter is devalued to the avoided cost of 3 or 4 cents, even though you're making less than you're consuming. So this is one of those cases where we really had to sharpen our pencils to make sure that we were doing the best economic thing we can do, because if we gave them power, we basically gave it away if it crossed the meter. Next slide, please. The climate is a significant factor in choosing support structures in South Dakota. I like to, high angle solar panels are often referred to as kites. In places like South Dakota, huge wind exposure and lift. So we put a lot of time into ensuring that, the panels stay where we install them. 2 locations were located at the casino, 9 were spread around that tribal square that we saw. We always like to take advantage of what we consider solar-ready roofs, and those are the standing seam metal roofs that we can just clip onto, no holes, very lightweight footprint. We've got some backup sites. We weren't able to do the powwow grounds. We always like to make our powwows energy neutral when we're able, but that instantaneous metering policy really excluded us from being able to do that at the powwow. But right sizing is a concept we kind of developed in Winnebago and really blossomed in Flandreau in getting the right type of capacity using PV watts or other load forecasting software to really get consumption and production properly matched up. All right, next slide, please. We avoided the big stuff right now for a number of reasons. The first of which it was economic reasons, but also policy reasons. We wanted to start small and partner with the local community to dispel concerns and fears that existed. So we thought this was an excellent first step to go after this retail net metering. We did have a larger cap at Prairie Junction site, which is actually reduced now to 50 kW, but generally working under 40 kW cap on the reservation itself. We did institute, this is the second time we instituted green camping into tribal casino RV parks, I think, and that has a great marketing angle, I think, too. There was a recent story in Indian Gaming that talked about the development of RV parks in the industry and how it's attracting people and blah, blah, blah. But no mention was made of the energy which is provided to these RV parks. So I think the green camping is a great little one-up on the tribal casino RV park front. We also instituted a shade structure in some of the locations to be able to integrate the solar panels into the human space and give them the dual purpose. And we accomplished some special engineering to enable us to be able to do that with standard Iron Ridge ground mount equipment. Next slide, please. This is what was designed for the tribe, and it uses, if anyone's familiar with the Iron Ridge design software, this stems from that, but we wanted to get the thing high enough so it cleared head height. So we could use underneath as a shade structure in the tribal areas. To do that with the standard 3-inch pipe, we had to, have extended concrete footings and stuff to protect. Note the shallow solar incident angle, 10 to 15 degrees, to reduce uplift at the same time. Next slide, please. This is kind of a unique feature of utilizing, bringing the solar into the human space where we can have our solar and eat it too, as it were, or at least use the space underneath it as a meaningful shade spot. Next slide, please. This is kind of a summary of the different sites, the types of mounts that we employed at each of the sites. That's the DCKW there with the estimated power consumption, site usage, and these are some pretty standard components in the right sizing process. Next slide, please. These are actual photos of our deployment in Flandreau. This was last fall. We did a lot of pre-cutting in the field under more, not in the field, in the shop, under more controlled conditions, and then moved the pre-cut, pre-assembled components to the field site, and that worked out very well. You'll notice here in the top left, we have an improvised, see in places like South Dakota, Nebraska, and North Dakota, you can't run a string line because at the other end of the line, there's a big bow between the two ends of the strings because of the wind always blowing. So we had to use actual boards to get straight lines, to punch our holes, to counteract the wind effects. And you can see that deployment down at the bottom as well. That's been operational since the end of last year. Next slide, please. Here's our pole mounts that we utilized, one of the 3 general approaches. We've gotten these pretty good again. Deliver the pole into the ground, pre-assemble the mount on the ground, lift it right on there, and they go pretty slick. Next slide. We love the S5 roof. S5 roof systems we install within our grant less than $2 a watt, completely turnkey installed. They involve just clamping onto the standing seam that's available on the roof, no punctures, less than 2 pounds per square foot. They're an excellent option for standing seam metal roofs, and in my view, are solar ready roofs. Next slide, please. Okay, Lacey.
I started, but I was on mute. I'm sorry about that. So going forward on some of the administrative factors, like Robert said, there are 11 sites. 9 are on trust land and 2 were on fee land. And then 10 of the sites were with one utility company, and one of the sites was with a different utility company. So we had quite a bit of factors going on with the paperwork to bring this project together. But with the tribe having a maintenance department that was well staffed, we were able to do a lot of the work here with our own folks, and the tribe also has an in-house legal department, and the legal department was also able to help with things like the building permits, getting the interconnection agreements with the 2 different utility providers. The tribe's partnership with the utility providers has really been helpful. Robert mentioned that looking at this project, going into this, we're kind of easing into solar because this is the first kind of project that the city of Flandreau, which has the 9 sites, has worked with before. So their city administrator hadn't worked on anything like this before, and they hired an engineer as a consultant to help them through the process, as well as paid their attorney to work on the interconnection agreements. And so the partnership has been very meaningful to push this forward because they are making some sacrifices, and the tribe recognizes that. The other factors that the tribe has been very fortunate in having is access to storage for all of this equipment. Robert and the maintenance team were full steam ahead until winter hit, and then really there's not a lot that one can do out here. The ground's frozen hard. So that was really helpful. There are also professional services that the tribe didn't have in-house, but that we were able to acquire, such as Robert's technical expertise and licensed electricians. Again, the tribe prioritized looking for an outfit. Jared's Electric has a licensed electrician that is a tribal member here. The COVID-19, oh, I forgot to ask for the next slide. Can you move it forward one, please? So the COVID-19 pandemic has delayed the schedule a bit, but nonetheless, the tribe has been moving pretty quickly on the project and getting the equipment installed. I'd say the weather was more of a factor than anything. But one of the challenges is that, like I said, it's a novelty project for this area. When the tribe went to the city council for the city of Flandreau, they did have some concerns regarding, how much would their profits be reduced by the tribe having this project. And once we had an open discussion about that, they felt pretty good. Like, it was not going to hurt their profits too much. I think they felt a lot more comfortable after we discussed it. And so someone said earlier to talk to your partners, talk to the utility providers early on when you're proposing a project. I think that's very good advice, and that helped the Flandreau-Santisi tribe a lot. But because this is a novelty project, it has also caused some delays. The city of Flandreau has not entered into any interconnection agreements before. And so there's been discussion back and forth about what those would look like. They wanted to have one for each site. And so that caused a bit of delay, but it really wasn't anything that the tribe wasn't able to overcome. Next slide, please. And so, in closing, like Robert said, we have projects in the bullpen. We're looking for new opportunities, not just for solar, but other ways to conserve energy and to use clean energy. With our projects, the tribe is learning to think ahead about energy rather than it being an afterthought in its construction projects. And with the tribe being the first to enter into interconnection agreements for a solar project with the city of Flandreau, the hope is that other people in the community will be able to use solar for their homes and in the, other maybe commercial endeavors in the community. And so the tribe really is kind of blazing the trail in that respect. So that pretty much concludes the tribe's presentation on the case study, unless Robert had anything he wanted to add.
No, that was very good, Lacey.
Thanks, Lacey and Robert. Congratulations on a great project there, and we'll look forward to hearing its performance down the road. But a cool project, and congratulations on the work. With that, let's start the questions. Looks like we have quite a bit of time for questions today, so please submit written questions if you have any. Audience, we do have some that we've received already, so let me just jump into those. First question for Carlin. We've been talking about behind the meter projects that are, I guess by definition, connected to the grid. Can you contrast the benefits and disadvantages of behind the meter with standalone projects, like off-grid projects, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say, off-grid projects are typically for remote locations, and so if you're not connected to the utility, then you probably have some sort of diesel genset, and so by using it's not really behind the meter because there's not a meter at that point, I guess. But you could then compare the economics of your diesel genset, the cost of getting the fuel there, the cost of the fuel itself, to the cost of a standalone solar project. So it's going to depend on your specific location. I will say that I know that in Alaska, the National Forest Service, they are certainly examining and putting in solar plus battery projects because they're finding it certainly to be a lot more economic than extending the current utility grid. So it's good for I guess the real answer is it depends, and feel free to ask for some technical assistance, and we can certainly help you to examine your specific situation.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. A question for Lacey, probably, maybe Robert. Lacey, you mentioned that the utility relationship was good between the tribe and the utility, a good working relationship. Can you attribute that to any? What has the tribe done to, I guess, groom that relationship, or do you have any thoughts on how to kind of build a strong relationship between the tribe and the utility, a good working relationship?
Sure. Well, especially with the city of Flandreau, they're the municipal provider here locally, and the tribe has a very long-standing partnership with the city, and it has worked on projects in the past, like bike paths and other things that benefit the community as a whole. The tribe is working with the city on a bridge project, and so the tribe's contributed funds for the public school and things like that. And so when the tribe has a project where it'd like the city's assistance, it's a lot easier to, get in ear and ask for help, because there really is a good communication there and a good working history. With Sioux Valley Energy, And then the Missouri River Energy Services and Basin Electric Power Cooperative, the tribe has been in contact with individuals on other energy matters, like, for example, the bill crediting program. And so it's been great to have somebody to reach out and call, just having that contact information and previous projects that were successes.
Great. Thanks, Lacey. Another question for the case study: as you bring these individual projects online, are you having to provide any backup power to the facilities during that time, or are they able to continue regular operation while the solar's connected?
I can field that one. I think we did a Topic 2A grant, so storage was not a component to be able to operate independently from the grid. That was not the intent. It was about offset. However, we did include one application that is net metered, that does have storage. It will not provide power if there is an outage, but it does hold power that is produced on site to be consumed instead of going across the meter and going for cheap. So this technology, I think, came out of Australia, where it's actually illegal to export energy to the grid, and this was basically eliminated the export from the site, using storage to hold the power produced and then to consume it behind the meter. We do have one site that we did with that technology, and that's going to be closely evaluated because that would directly address the policy of the instantaneous metering. And that's how, what came first, the radar gun or the radars, so this is a technology that can address that particular aspect of the interconnection policy in South Dakota.
Thanks, Robert. Just I guess a follow-on to that. I think that the questioner is concerned about having to shut a facility down if it's if they're building a solar project on a roof of, say, a casino or something, while the project makes its final connection. What's your experience on some of these facilities that you're building with these 10 or 11 projects, individual projects? Have you had brief power outages, for that final connection, or are there ways to avoid that?
And I'm sorry if I misunderstood that. It's very rare that the building power would have to be shut down to integrate or commission a net metering application, because they will feed into the building subpanel on a breaker specifically within the panel or a subpanel. So when they're tied into the breaker, that breaker is simply energized, and the rest of the operation is not affected. That being said, there is always some rare examples where there's no room on the panels, a new panel has to be in place, and for some reason you need to tie back into the building supply, which may trigger a shutoff. But generally, that's not the case with these behind the meter systems.
Great, thanks, Robert. A question here: what are some of the potential issues with utilities for behind the meter projects, behind the meter residential systems? How do they potentially negatively impact a utility? I guess that's just for the panel in general. So anyone who wants to respond.
Yeah, so this is Carlin, and I would say in a lot of states, the utilities earn their revenue by selling power
especially at the residential level on a per kilowatt hour basis. So if a utility sells fewer kilowatt hours because a residential homeowner has put a PV system on their roof, then that lowers the amount of money in services that the utility provides to that customer. So that can be seen as negatively. If you talk to a utility, they will also say, well, I will hope that you will maintain your system and then it will be operating the way that you anticipate. However, if it goes down or there's a large weather event and it's damaged, because I am the utility, I need to make sure that the overall system can provide power to you. And therefore, I still need to maintain some level of services, distribution, transmission, and supply in order to provide for you just in case. So those are some of the challenges that I have heard utilities say with behind the meter systems.
Thanks, Carlin. Any other thoughts from the panel? Are there power quality issues, for instance, that can be experienced?
Well, and yeah, on the flip side, I will say that if your house or building that you're trying to provide power to is at the end of a radial line, there can actually be an advantage to the utility system by having a solar system at the end of that radial line. It can lower the utility maintenance costs, et cetera, especially if it's a PV plus battery storage system. So again, it all depends on your particular situation and location and the utility that you're working with.
Great, thanks.
I'd like to just add, if I could just add, utilities, it's true that the standby capacity is there, but you're also talking about the size of a system that's typically designed to be less than what they're consuming. So there's a lot of whining from utilities about the deleterious effects to the grid from net metering installations. But I think the numbers don't really support that, in my view. And in most cases, net metering applications don't really have much more impact on the grid than energy conservation. And I think it should be almost considered, that impact should be considered in that way, because it's not a big plant, it's not a PPA, exporting megawatts, it's just using less, by on-site production. And there's a lot of hemming and there's a lot of gnashing of teeth from the utilities about it, but I think at the end of the day, it's not really much of an impact to what they're doing.
Thanks, Robert. To the audience, we have one last question left. If you have any more, please get them in, because after this we'll be wrapping up shortly. Question for you, Margie, and it's kind of general, but give your best shot at responding. Is there a scale at which an energy development scale, like project scale or number of projects, at which it makes sense to develop a tribal utility code or some of the laws that can help support those sorts of efforts? Do you have kind of some general thoughts or guidance on, when it might be cost effective or appropriate to establish the specific tribal law?
Well, I wouldn't say there is. Anytime you pass a law, it's a political process, and you really do have to consider your relationship with your existing utilities, because if you're going to go to your existing utility and say, we're going to pass a law that's going to make you change what you're doing, they're not going to like that. And, you know, there is going to have to be a discussion there. It's also, of course, related to the tribe's relationship to the state, because utilities, some of which are regulated by the state, they can't necessarily change their cost structures because their rates that are approved by the state are include the tribal loads as well as the non-tribal loads. So it could impact what they're doing with the state. So sometimes the states will get involved, and so it really just depends on, you know, what the tribe wants to do, how controversial it might be, how important it is to the tribe to push something through. And so I would say that, you know, there's a lot of factors that a tribal attorney and a tribal council has to consider anytime they're going to pass a tribal law. I would say that the fact of the matter that federal Indian law supports the tribe's inherent sovereign right to determine how its own loads are served, that provides some flexibility for you to go to your utility and say, hey, we could pass a law, but the better way of doing this is to just create an agreement that helps everybody get to a win-win situation. So the tribe gets the type of system it wants, and the utility can cover its cost, and if they're a for-profit utility, make a reasonable profit, but do something that's flexible and that allows everybody to you know, create something that works for them without necessarily forcing it down the utility's throat through a tribal law.
Great, thanks, Margie. That's helpful. With that, we don't have any additional questions, so I want to thank all of our presenters again for their time today and the excellent presentations. We are interested in suggestions for how to strengthen the value of this training, so please send us any feedback that you have. On our final slide here, we have the remaining webinars of the 2020 series. The next webinar, titled Major Energy Project Agreements, will be held on September 30th at the same time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Thanks again for your interest and attendance, and we look forward to you joining us on future webinars. This concludes the webinar for today. Good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.